Hi everybody. So welcome to Rhode Island. We have about a week left of summer. It's about mid-September now, so we're approaching our autumn season. And I thought it would be nice to take everybody on a virtual Amanita hunt to unlock some of the secrets of how cryptic this genus is and how versatile all the mushrooms are in it. So for starters, some of the terminology I may be using may be unfamiliar to you, and I may go between older monograph sections of Amanita or newer ones. So if you're unfamiliar with the names, best thing I can say is do your research, keep up to date on the names, and let's begin. So our first stop today on today's virtual Amanita hunt we have the iconic Amanita muscaria. Now in the northeast here we have in Rhode Island, our primary species is Amanita muscaria variation Caesaria, our yellow variation. But how do we know this is Amanita muscaria? So some things that we want to look for here. We can see this orangish coloration in the middle that's fading this yellow color. And we can also see the design of the warts that we have here. Bit friable, kind of dispersing itself along. And we also have this light striate margin, which is very characteristic to section Amanita. But there are a lot of members of section Amanita, so how do we want to know this is Amanita muscaria? With all Amanita, we want to dig the base up. We'll try to be as careful as we can. This one is under a rock at an angle. So she did break a little bit on me, but that's okay, we can piece her back together. So we have the Amanita muscaria. So some things to note on this is the base is a little clavate here, and it's always characterized by these collars, these rings of material on the lower stipe, which is very characteristic to the muscarioids in general, particularly Caesaria that we have here. And one thing I always like people to note is the design of these gills. You can almost see these little spaces of triangles where it's empty. This is where the short gills end. So all Amanita have gills that go from the margin of the cap to the stem. Sometimes they connect, sometimes they don't. And all Amanita also have what we call short gills. Now with these short gills, we want to look at how many there are in abundance, the diversity of the length, and we also want to look at the shape as well. This is a good example here. Let me zoom in. Now the shape of this gill right here we call truncate. So it comes down and stops very abruptly and just drops down straight, almost at a 90-degree angle right here. You can see another one here. You can see another one here. This one's still cut, not quite at a straight angle, but we call this truncate short gills, which is very characteristic to section Amanita in general. Our first stop today, Amanita muscaria, variation Caesaria. Our next stop now, with the camera in particular, the fact that this is so overexposed, being white and hard to focus on the cap, it's a really good warning sign of members of Amanita section Phalloidia. This one looks a little rained on and washed out. characteristics of this white cap with no warts like the muscarioid does. This stem. Now this stem doesn't have collared rings, but it has this material that is very scaly and hairy that goes all the way up the stem. That's very classic to what we call Amanita ameriverosa here in the Northeast. And again, with all Amanita, we want to dig out the base. And a key characteristic for these destroying angels is this vulva. This is a sac on the bottom. You can peel it away and see it. Section Phalloidia houses all our dangerous, deadly toxic members, so we definitely don't want to eat this one. But just for characteristics involved, this one has lost her skirt. We'll see a few more up the trail. But note the size. Rather large and robust. This is one of our late season destroying angels. Fairly confident and is ameriverosa, but one thing we can do is smell it for its aroma. So this is not Amanita ameriverosa. I smell rotted onion. So we have another member here late season we call Amanita subaliacea, which is our garlic odor destroying angel. And the age of this really pronounces that aroma for us to smell and really know what's going on. We'll toss this off the trail so nobody gets it. A lot of people walk their dogs. This is another member of Section Amanita. Note the size. Note the mild striate margin that we have here. This fade of color, much more white colored towards the end, fades into this straw yellow orange hue, and it's a little more brown in the center. Now, one thing I like to note on this is the design of the warts. There's multiple squamules of sorts of these warts on the cap, which is a hint to its name as Amanita multisquamosa. One thing we like to note on these, this is in a group of Section Amanita we call funnel-veiled panthers. Now, it has a funnel veil, which it lifts up when the cap spreads away. So it's not hanging down, flowing like a skirt. It's lifted up, which is very characteristic of this small group of Amanita in Section Amanita. And always, digging up the base, we can see this boot. We call this a booted base, which is very characteristic to all the panthers. That's in subsection Pantherine. And we also have a small one here, which we may find some better characteristics because she is so young. So looking at the skirt, I mentioned they're called funnel veils. And we can see how the cap is starting to expand away from the stem and it's pulling the skirt with it. And if we can see it slightly at an angle, we can see how it's not breaking away, it's getting pulled up by the cap, which is what you see when it's young. But we can obviously see that these are the same species at different ages. Both have very similar booted bases. Both have the multiple squamules on the cap and the coloration. This is in Section Amanita. This is one of our toxic members, similar toxins to Amanita muscaria, which are isoxazoxyl derivatives. So we have more Amanita here. So these ones are a little bit younger. These are those destroying angels. We can tell by that vulva cup that the base is growing out of. This scaly fibrous stem. This one still has a skirt on her, and notice how it's draping down, slightly turning yellow on the margin here. We have another here, and there is even a smaller one here, which is much more digged down. So, one thing I didn't mention earlier, I mentioned Amanita, which was incorrect. We realized it was incorrect due to the scent. So this, notice how, where it's starting to grow from, this egg, it's in the topsoil. One thing I'd like to mention with Amanita, even though this isn't it, is that Amanita prefers to burrow itself a few inches down, so it's very difficult to dig up in one piece. Just to let you know, and I'll smell this one again. And it still has this garlic aroma to it. So the characteristics again, super exposed with the bright. That's what destroying angels like to do to our cameras. This one has the skirt, which is weak, and it has this vulva that is popping out of on the bottom. So with Amanita, a lot of them start off in a vulva. It's like an egg, and when it pops out, it shoots out and leaves the base at the bottom. And other members like the multisquamosa, those little squamules on the cap, that's pieces of that egg as well, that vulva. We call that a universal veil. It covers the whole mushroom when it's young, and it releases itself when it pops up. The skirt we refer to as the partial veil. Now the purpose of the partial veil is to protect the gills when they're young. So different from section Amanita, looking at the short gills, notice how they're not squarely cut off. And there's even a fork here, which is common. But notice how they kind of taper off into the distance underneath the gills here. Alright? This is what we call rounded, and it has a plethora of these short gills as well. Always worth noting on all Amanita, the short gills. This is one of our blushers that we have here in the Northeast. She's a little old, so I won't go into details on her, besides the fact we can see this blushing red coloration as it gets old. And we can even see on top of the skirt here. And notice how different from the multisquamosa, this skirt flows right down. It's not getting pulled up. The base of these blushers down here is generally the first point that you'll see where the blushing happens. And if you take a cross section from top to bottom, even if you find a blusher that doesn't have any blushing on it, it will at least have a little bit of blemishes, at least on the very center on the inside, starting at the base here before it starts working itself up. This is another destroying angel. This is likely all the same species that we're going to be seeing in this section of the trail. Duly noted by the white cap, this skirt, and that cup base on the bottom we call a vulva. So we have a couple members here. Now this is a member of section Phalloidia. We have an older one, which is knocked over. And we can note the fade of color on the cap, how it's very light on the outside and very dark in the center. This is the same species as this one right here. So to be confusing with this is a member of section Phalloidia that does have some blushing that we see here in the cap. But this is not a blusher. How do we know it's not a blusher? We dig it up. It is very important with all Amanita to dig the base up. So here at the base, we call this a cleft base or a star foot. So our star foot Amanita that we have here in the Northeast is called Amanita brunensis, which classically has this brown colored cap. May or may not have the warts on the top, which are very thin. They're not pointy. This cleft base, it has a skirt. It can blush. The big characteristic of this being in Ceres brunensis is its aroma. The aroma of this whole group, and it's not Ceres brunensis, I mean, that's Stirps brunensis that this is in Ceres mappe. Every member of Ceres mappe has a raw potato or a radish-like aroma to it. Again, just confirming this is in Section Validae. All members of Section Validae are edible after cooking. Here we have a few more. Moving on in characteristics of these, this is also brunnescent, so we can see these light splotches of red. Almost like little drops on the cap that happens. This is very characteristic to brunnescence, as long as these radial designs, these fibrils, that kind of spread in coloration from the center to the end of the cap. Now, one thing to note on this, being in Section Validae, is that it doesn't have a striate margin, like the members of Section Amanita that we've gone over. Here we have another Amanita. This one's not getting exposed too much. Now, you might be a little bit afraid of this girl being so white as she is, but we can see trace vellum remnants on the cap, which suggests that this is not a member of Section Phalloidia, and it doesn't have the fibril-like stipe as the destroying angels have, and it's very smooth, as we can see here. So even though this is very white, we want to dig her up, and we will also note a cleft base. Very similar to Amanita brunnescens. It's actually in the same grouping. This is also a potato-smelling one. Note that slight drop of red on the cap. With this skirt, no lines on the margin of the cap. We refer to this one as Amanita aestivalis, which is our American white starfoot Amanita. Very similar to brunnescens. We will also see a few of these. Let's see if we can get her to focus. Notice that multitude of squamules I mentioned on the cap. Now this one's very white. This is more classic for this area, for our multisquamosa. We can see the skirt, much more pronounced, being pulled up. It's not flowing down. And the base that we have, rounded, mildly booted. This is a much better example of the funnel veil that we have on these funnel veil panthers. So note the cap on this Amanita. Notice the distribution of the vellum on the cap. It's not quite multiple squamules, although you might say that this one piece can be broken into about 4 or 5 here. So this is really cryptic on this. We do see this striate margin, and we do see this yellow coloration on the cap. So from what we've seen so far, is this a muscaria? Is this a panther? Is it multisquamosa? Let's find out. How do we find out? Dig the base up. So this is a very classic saccade of a boot on the base of this. Also has this uplifted vulva. But the colorations of this and the distribution of vellum are very iffy for multisquamosa. So we do have another member of subsection Pantherine we call Amanita subvelotypes. So going back to the size of the mushroom, Amanita subvelotypes is a rather small mushroom. Notice it can fit in my hands. We also have velotypes, which is a much larger, girthier Amanita. Very similar in relation to this. This is the mini version, so to say. This orange coloration without all those multiple squamules on the cap and that very saccate booted base that it has is characteristic to Amanita subvelotypes. Multitude of squamules. Booted base. However, the size of this is much larger than my hands. And these trace remnants on the bottom of collared material, this is where the crypticness of section Amanita comes into play. Could this be a faded muscaria? Very well could be. Could it be a panther? Absolutely. Now, which of those two is going to lose its skirt more than the other one? I would think a muscaria would. Notice how it very seems exanelate, which means doesn't have a skirt. And there's one little material of the vellum on the bottom of that collared ring. So this one's kind of up in the air. I could go both ways, booted, Pantherine, or muscaria. With this multiple squamules in the center, I would suggest that this is a panther. We have another funnel veil, white multisquamosa. Do note that striate margin on the cap. I've dubbed this place Amanita Alley for a reason. A large variety of species, loaded with multisquamosa among other things, during the right time of year. I'm trying to walk fast, not to bore you with not too much stuff going on. We can always look at the sights. More multisquamosa. More multisquamosa. Here's a good example of the multisquamosa with that booted base, which is classic. And you can see what I mean by this multiple squamules of material that are left on the cap and distributed. This is our Amanita brunensis. One little piece of material left in the center. Hanging skirt. So, this is not Amanita brunensis. See how cryptic they can fool you. There's an aroma that we need to see on this one right here. I've just smelt it, it's very fruity. So look at this grayish, brownish tone to the cap. And this is a member of section Phalloidia. However, with the skirt and the base, we have a slight vulva of a cup. So what does this tell us? We have a vulva cup, we have a skirt, we have a multitude of short gills. I see many of them are truncate. And looking very, very close here, the margin of the cap. I mentioned section Phalloidia has a smooth margin. There are no striations on the cap. So if we look at this fade, it's almost like a white ring around the outside with these very short striations moving into the color. So this is a member of section Caesaria or Caesaria. Has a vulva on the bottom. Has a skirt. Has this brown cap. Relatively large size, even though this one's not very large. Minus that with these truncate short gills and a multitude of those gills. Very characteristic for section Caesaria. Now everything in section Caesaria is edible. One thing to note, which we can't see on this, is the skirt, and I've already damaged it a little bit with my hands, is that in age this will turn gray. It's a good characteristic to note. And this might be the highlight of today. This is a mushroom that we call Amanita welleslei. Now Amanita welleslei is in section Amanita. Most members of section Amanita have isoxazoxal derivatives. There are psychoactive toxins in it. However, this is in a small group within that section that don't contain any of these toxins. But very characteristic of welleslei is the coloration, this peach of the cap. This margin, we have this sterile band of material on the margin of the cap, which actually extends beyond where the gills are, which is rather unique to welleslei. And we can see a lot of this material that's hanging off the edge. We call that an appendiculate margin, where it has this appendages on the edge of the cap, right here. So this one in particular, the skirt is very weak. And we can see this yellow material towards the bottom. Now, I did mention if you ever want to know what an Amanita is, you really have to dig it up to find out. But the size of these Amanita wellesleis and the beauty that they have, I don't have the heart in me to dig these up and leave them and let them do their thing. So just for everybody else to enjoy, let's see if I can pan a little bit around these. And a cool thing to note, which I'm not sure if we can see here, is that the gills will change color. As it matures and gets old, they'll turn very orangish. What a beautiful find. We have a member of section Amanita. Not quite the squamulose cap. The skirt looks like it's hanging, but see how it's kind of jutting out? This means that it was actually pulled out and pulled up before it fell over. Minus that, we see this nice booted base.